Today at Speedy's Garage we're going to be installing a line lock kit, otherwise known as a roll control kit from Hurst. Basically what this will do is we'll lock the front tires when doing a burnout at the track. It comes with a solenoid, some hard brake lines, electrical connectors, which I probably won't use because I don't particularly like these chintzy splice type connectors. I got to get into the wiring and kind of see what's involved, but I'll probably solder most everything I can. They come with a safety switch as well as a momentary push button. When you push it, it's on. Let go, it's off. Came with just black wiring. Since the solenoid has power and ground, I'll probably throw in some of my own red wiring to keep everything color coded. Came with some wire loom and the bracket to install it and some instructions. I'm going to go probably a step further. And I had a custom shift knob made by Speedy shift knobs. I did a custom font for the numbers and letter. Had them put hang on the side just for something different. And this is how mine will be activated. I can hold it down, the line lock's on, holding the front tires, let it go when I'm done with the burnout and roll forward. Came with a bushing as an adapter to make it fit the Hurst shift knob. And as one final step, I picked up some of these small toggle switches. And I'm kind of thinking safety here. I'll probably have this be an arm switch. So turn one of these on. I'll probably mount it somewhere on the console. That will arm the system to make this button active. Otherwise, the system is turned off. And just for your reference, here's the part number for the Hurst roll control kit. And the reason I went with the Hurst model is because the solenoid was a little bit more beefy than the other ones I saw from SLP, and it's rebuildable. Okay, I'm just getting into this and I'm already having to make my first change. For some reason and this is very common, a lot of manufacturers, they include really chintzy hardware with nice equipment, and they want you to use red Loctite on these 1/4 by 20 hex bolts to mount the solenoid to the bracket. They give you lock washers and flat washers, and they say use red Loctite. But why didn't they just give a lock nut that has the nylon lock ring already in it? So I just went to my handy dandy bolt bottle, got a 1/4 by 20 lock nut. I hope you can see that. It's got a nylon locking ring inside of it, and I'm just going to use that and take care of it without any of all this other mess. To tighten down the hex bolt, you'll need a 3/16 Allen wrench. The instructions do not say you need this tool, so make sure you have one for those. And then the nuts I'm using are 7/16, which is also what the Hurst ones were. Next, you're going to take all the plugs out of the solenoid and seal them with some Teflon tape to ensure you don't get any leaks. Okay, next you want to insert the plugs with the Teflon tape on them. And I found putting it in a vise and holding it by the bracket made tightening these a lot easier. So you might want to try that. It's hard to hold it in your hand and tighten those. Okay, I wanted to give you a better look at how these connections go. So the bottom front is plugged, left side is plugged, top is master cylinder, right side is to the ABS system. Okay, next I test fit the brake lines. We're not going to install them yet, but I wanted to know how it was going to go in the car. So it's going to mount to that little ring tab right there. And you can kind of get an idea of how the brake lines will go. So I test fit and everything looks good. Okay, now we're ready to start installing some brake lines. We're going to start by removing this factory brake line here. It's the one that runs to this large 18mm connection joint. We're going to remove that brake line, and be careful with the brake fluid. It will eat paint and plastic, so make sure you have everything protected and covered up. Wipe up any brake fluid immediately if it spills. And to do this, you're going to need an 18mm and 13mm wrenches. I'm just putting these in finger tight for now, so that'll give me some adjustment room when I actually install the solenoid. Okay, so I've set the solenoid in loosely on this bracket, put a rag or something behind it to keep it from scratching the fender. And you will have to adjust these lines more than likely. Mine didn't fit exactly, and so to take tension off and make it fit nice and everything be comfortable, I had to bend this one back a little bit and the bottom one up a little bit. It's manageable by hand. You can use like a wooden dowel or something as leverage between the radius bends if you need to. This was the tightest one I had to do, and I had to bend this back to give room for the solenoid to sit away from the fender so that it didn't rattle against it while I was driving. And finally, just come in and tighten all your flare nuts snug. You don't want to over tighten them because it can actually cause a leak. You just want them snugged up when you feel the line bottom out in the adapter. One final adjustment I made to make sure the solenoid doesn't tap the fender is I actually twisted that little mounting bracket where it mounts up just a little bit. I don't know if you can tell on the video, but just enough to give me about a 1/4 inch of space between the solenoid and the fender. And with the hard lines that hold it, it's not going anywhere. One final thing on the flare nuts, all of them are 13 millimeter. The two down there, the one at the ABS distribution point, except for this one. The one that connects up to the line at the top, this is 18 millimeters on this side. This flare nut's a 14 millimeter. Next you want to bleed the brakes, and I use a clear piece of 3/16 vinyl tube on the brake caliper, and I run into an old water bottle. And you can either pressurize the reservoir with 10 psi of pressure if you have a speed bleeder, something like that, or a motive power bleeder, or have someone pump the brakes in the car as you tighten and loosen the bleed screw. And you want to start in the back right corner, which is back passenger side, then back driver's side, then front passenger side, and then finally front driver's side. And as you're bleeding the brakes, you want to make sure and keep the brake fluid reservoir topped up with fluid so it doesn't run dry. If it does, you'll have to start all over again because you'll end up introducing air into the system. And I like this. This is what I've used. It's compatible with .3 and .4 systems, and it's synthetic brake fluid. So that's what I was topping mine up with as I bled the brakes. Now that we got the solenoid installed, we need to start working on the wiring. It's a pretty simple device. It just has power and ground to activate it, but you need to think about how you want it to actually work once you have it wired into the car. To ground the solenoid, I plan to either use this connection here, just run the black wire right to that bolt because that is a ground, or there's one right by the battery box. I'm going to look at both and decide which one to use. The only thing that concerns me about using this one is that it's right below the opening of the hood, and I'm afraid water and other things might get on it and over time cause it to corrode. The power line, or 12-volt line, I will run around and follow those corrugated tubes right there, and I will go in the grommet. Try to get you a look at it. Right there, where I ran through everything else that goes into the cab of the car. And that comes out right underneath the dash behind the steering wheel. You will need a switched 12-volt source for this to work. And if you've seen any of my other videos, you know I installed a circuit boss, which is here. And it actually gives me 3 switched 12-volt sources of power that I ran into the cab of the car. I'll end up using the third one for the line lock. To make accessing and running the wires easier, I'm going to remove these trim pieces here, here, and here, and drop this lower half of the dash down to the floorboard. There's just a couple of Phillips head screws that hold this in place. One's on the side, one's underneath right over here, and the rest of it's just push pins. Just kind of pop it and it'll pop off and lay on the floor. When it comes loose, you will need to disconnect the light switch connector. It's right here, and then it'll drop on down. You can leave the parking brake hooked up, it won't hurt anything. Next, I'm removing this metal shield. So this is why I like to stay really organized when it comes to wiring, and always have a wiring diagram. I was able to come back, it was probably 2 years ago that I installed all my wiring and my gauges, and I labeled the third Circuit Boss switch 12 volt wire that I didn't use with a piece of painter's tape. So it made it really easy to come back in here, grabbed it, knew exactly which one it was. So it saved me probably an hour of trying to find it. Okay, as I said earlier, I didn't particularly care for the electrical parts that came with the Hurst Line Lock. And I said I went and got a micro or mini round toggle switch, and it is illuminated. I'm going to mount it right here. So this will be my arming switch. And this is optional. You don't really have to do it this way. I'm just doing it mainly because it's a 6-speed car, and 2 for safety. So this, I'll flip that on, the system will be active, and then I'll install my Speed Dog ball with the button on the top, and that will actually activate the solenoid. So when I push the button and hold it, the brakes will be locked. When I let it go, they'll release. And I wanted to do it that way so that when I was shifting or whatever during a burnout, I had the button right here, and I didn't have to worry about trying to find it to turn it off. And there's a lot going on in a 6-speed car with the clutch and the shifting and the ball and everything else. In an automatic, you could probably just do a toggle switch, turn it on, do your burnout, turn it off. But on a 6-speed car, I wanted it right there on the shifter. Most people opt to put their switches in this little tray. This rubber liner pops out, and they'll put them in there so that if they ever take them out, they can just cover them back up with this. I want mine closer to the shifter, and if I ever get, bad enough to want this thing to be put back to stock, I'll just replace this console part right there. It's not that expensive. The Hurst instructions give you some wiring diagrams. I always draw my own so that I understand exactly what I'm doing, and I'll eventually transfer this over to a Visio diagram like I did for my gauge install and everything. I always keep these with the car in case I have a problem. I can go back and reference them and quickly troubleshoot any issues I may have. So that's how we're going to wire it up. It's going to go, the solenoid's going to get grounded, then it's going to run, the power side's going to run to the momentary switch in the handle. That's going to run, the other side of the push button switch on the shift knob is going to run to the toggle switch, which gets 12 volts and ground. Now when you click the toggle switch down, it'll be active, it'll light up letting you know that it's armed, and then when you push the momentary button in the shift knob, that circuit becomes complete, solenoid gets activated. Now to make the connections, you can use some of these. They're just plastic, cheap spade connectors. I usually use the insulated ones if I'm going to use these. However, recently a friend of mine who was a electrical technician and retired turned me on to this type of stuff. So you can actually take the pins, solder them on, plug them into these connectors, and it's more OEM. So these two, this is male and female, they'll plug together. You just have to figure out which pins go where, and I did that in this little diagram so I know exactly what I was doing. The toggle switch has 3 pins, 1, 2, 3. The momentary has 2 wires. Your Hurst has a wire coming in, and then you've got your 12 volt source, which will come from my Circuit Boss, and you got ground. And that way if I take the console out or whatever, I can just unplug it like a factory connection. For the wiring, I'm going to be using my cordless soldering iron, which I love. Some heat shrink tubing, obviously the wire strippers, and some loom to protect it. If you watch any of my other videos, you've already seen this, but I always like to mention it. Whenever you're doing soldering connections, you always want to have a mechanical connection first. So I've twisted the wires together in 2 loops and then solder them together so you have mechanical and solder connection. And you want to heat the wire, not the solder. So heat the wire up and let it absorb the solder. When it gets warm, you'll know it. You just tap the solder to it a few times and you'll see it start to melt into the wire and you're good to go. Just hold it there and let it absorb some. And there's what a proper soldered connection should look like. The solder is absorbed by the wires. And I always cover solder connections with some heat shrink. And I'll cover the whole wire up with some loom. And this is the nylon stuff. It's got a gray stripe on it right there, denoting high temp. I'm going to use it in the engine bay. So I decided to route the ground wire for the solenoid up to that ground lug, since that's what the factory used. I ran it underneath the fuse box. The loom is installed. Next we're going to run the power wire. Okay, we've got the power line run around the back of the motor, zip tied up neatly, and through the grommet, the back of the engine bay. Next, we're going to pop a couple of trim pieces out. On the stick shift car, this bezel is first, and it just pops straight up. If you just give it a tug, it's got 4 connections, one at each corner. And I went ahead and took off the middle tray cover. It's sitting over there in the seat, and it just pops up really easy. Just go really easy around the edges. You'll see all the connectors there. And next we're going to pop this up to gain access to where we're going to put our toggle switch, which is over here. Now if you're going to put your toggle switch in a different spot, like right there underneath that tray, you might not even have to take it out, because I can actually reach that from where I'm at now. You can just reach right underneath here and get to that tray. But since I want mine right there, I'm going to take this off. And this pops up pretty easy. You can just grab it by the cup holder and give it a good tug, and it will come out, and you'll have to disconnect your electrical connections underneath. Okay, I'm preparing the Hurst shifter for the wiring that's going to run through it. It's got a rubber grommet on the bottom that your leather boot wraps around, and then a zip tie holds the leather boot. I had to make a small notch in that rubber coupler right there, a rubber O-ring, to let the wire pass through. The Speed Dog shift ball comes with the wire, about 8 inches of it covered with some heat shrink tubing, which looks pretty good. But to better protect it, I went ahead and got some expandable mesh loom and put on the wire, and then put heat shrink on each end to protect it and keep it in place. Okay, so there's the boot reinstalled with the zip tie holding it. We got the wire running through. Here's what it looks like from the top. Nice and factory. I may need to put a zip tie or something around this, or a Velcro strap to hold it. I'll drop it around a little bit and kind of see how it does. Okay, so I've connected up my 12-volt switch supply, which is coming from my circuit box in the engine bay. Run it across here, following the rest of my cables. One of these is 12-volt switch supply voltage. The other one is the solenoid power connection. I'm going to run behind the center console and back into here. To give me easier access, I'm going to go ahead and remove the whole center console out. It's 2 Phillips head screws and then 4 8mm bolts. There's also a couple of electrical connections to deal with to get the console out. One is the iPod connector. It unplugs and you push it, those plastic pins, out. And the difficult one is always these 12-volt accessory connectors, like your, cigarette plug or whatever you want to call it. Those are always a pain in the butt to get out. I'd use a plastic tool to push that one and pop him out. Now we're ready to run the wiring. Since I had to order some electronic parts for another project, I decided not to use the Radio Shack connector, although it will work. It's just a 4-pin connector. It's a little bit bigger than I wanted. So I ordered these from Mauser Electronics, and they're a 3-pin connector, which is what I need for my activation switch. And this stuff's really easy to use, and the reason I like these is because they're very OEM-ish. They plug together. This part will go to the car. This part will go to my activation switch. If you ever need to take it out, just unplugs. And the way they work is you crimp one of the pins. This is a female pin, and I'll put that in the female side, obviously. And then you crimp male pins on the male side. When it plugs together, it makes your connection. If you want to get really particular, you can actually put a drop of solder in here too for extra security on the connection. When making your wire harness, make sure you leave enough slack so if you ever have to lift this up, you've got enough wire to get to the plug without pulling on it. I'll do this one in a loop underneath the console. And also, before you put your connector on, make sure it'll fit through your hole, or run your wire through first and then put your connector on. I drilled a 1/2-inch hole in the console to mount the arm switch, and then I used a Dremel with a sanding barrel on it to just gently enlarge the hole, and I would test fit the switch, enlarge a little bit more, test fit it again, until I had it nice and snug, and it would snap into place without being too tight or too loose. And to make routing the harness clean, I use one of those mountable type zip ties. You drill a hole, and it pops in, and the zip tie goes through the loop to hold it in place, and it'll protect the pins from pulling as well. So if I ever do lift this console out, it'll pull from here and protect the switch. And that's what we end up with after we put our connector on. A factory looking switch harness. For the momentary switch and the shift handle, I just use some standard insulated spade connectors since it's only one connection. One side's going to go to our solenoid wire, positive, and one side's going to go to our activation arming switch accessory connection, which would be pin 1 in my case. I used two different types of connectors. I didn't make them both female or both male. I used one female and one male. That way I can't mix them up. If I ever unplug it, I'll know which one went back to which connection. To ground the LED light in the arming toggle switch so that it lights up, I'm using the female side, or I'm sorry, the male side of that plug that we put on the other end, on the wiring harness that went to the switch in the console. And I ran the ground back to this little computer module thing right here. I don't know what it does, but those are ground bolts because they bolt to the body. And I put a ring terminal on that one and just ran it up, and that'll plug into the ground of the switch. And I ran it underneath the carpet just like the factory wiring. Okay, so this is how I finished up routing the wiring. I zip tied the momentary push button switch to the spot where the stock shifter would bolt into the Hurst shifter block. Made a nice spot right there so that it travels with the shifter. Won't worry about it rubbing on anything. Then I used a Velcro strap to bundle the wires together. Here's our momentary switch connections right here. This one goes from the solenoid to the momentary switch, and then one of our pins that goes to our arming switch in the console goes to the other side of the momentary switch with that connector, so that when we push the button, it'll only work when the switch is armed. And that will plug into this 3-pin housing that I installed. So now it's just time to put the console back in the car. As I said early on, I always do a wiring diagram for all the electronics in the car, so that if I ever have trouble, a year or two from now, I can come back and know exactly how it was hooked up. So here's the line lock, there's the ground for the line lock solenoid, there's the activation or power to the solenoid coming in to the momentary switch, which I labeled the wire colors. It's dark green, red, black. There's my arming switch, which goes to switch power coming from the circuit boss, and then it gets ground, and that's what the diagram looks like. I did it in Visio. You can use other programs. You can probably download something free that makes these, or at the very least just draw it out on paper by hand and label everything. And then I also went back and updated the overall gauge wiring diagram that I have for the car, and updated my circuit boss to show that that purple wire coming from the circuit boss fuse number 3, which is the 3rd circuit, now goes to my Hurst activation toggle switch. Okay, so we got the console back in the car, the arming switch lined up exactly where I want it to. Activate it. It's now armed. When you push this button, it locks the brakes. So we push on the brake pedal, push this button, and they will stay locked even when your foot's off the brake until I release the button. So now we just need to give it a test to make sure it works. The Hurst Line Lock worked great, and I really liked the Speed Dog shift knob with the push button switch installed. It made it really easy at the track to get the line lock going and lock the brakes and everything. The Hurst Line Lock is a high quality piece. The solenoid comes with a heat sink, as you saw, and the stainless steel lines are high quality. The connections are good. The only chintzy parts of the whole thing were the electrical connectors that they gave us and the mounting hardware, which is, both problems are easily solvable with a trip to the hardware store. If you'd like to see some more project information, visit my website, www.speedysgarage.net.